When an ancient Egyptian died, their journey to the afterlife had just begun. The ancient Egyptians believed death was not the end, but a transition to eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise that was essentially a perfected version of Egypt. But reaching this paradise required their physical body to survive intact. They believed the soul consisted of multiple parts: the Ka, the life force; the Ba, the personality that could travel between worlds; and the Ak, the transformed spirit. For these spiritual elements to function properly in the afterlife, they needed a preserved physical body to return to. This is why the ancient Egyptians developed mummification, the most sophisticated preservation technique in the ancient world. The process took exactly 70 days and involved removing the internal organs, drying the body with salt, coating it with resins and oils, wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen, and placing protective amulets throughout the wrappings. It wasn't simple embalming. It was sacred science, combining practical preservation with religious ritual. The embalmers, called WT, were both medical practitioners and priests who performed their work in special structures called Ibu, the place of purification. These workshops were located on the west bank of the Nile, the direction of the setting sun and the land of the dead. What happened inside these buildings was kept secret from ordinary Egyptians. The process was considered sacred and somewhat frightening. But modern archaeology, including CT scans of mummies and ancient papyrus texts describing the procedures, has revealed exactly how ancient Egyptians turned the dead into eternal beings. Warning: the details are graphic, disturbing, and absolutely fascinating. The mummification process began immediately after death, within hours if possible. First, the body was taken to the Ibu and washed with water from the Nile and palm wine. Then came the most disturbing part: organ removal. The embalmers would make an incision on the left side of the abdomen, about 4 inches long, using a sharp flint or obsidian blade. Through this opening, they would carefully remove the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs. Each organ was washed, dried, treated with natron salt, wrapped in linen, and placed in special containers called canopic jars, which were buried with the mummy. But here's what's truly shocking. They removed the brain through the nose. The embalmers would insert a long bronze hook up through the nostril, break through the ethmoid bone at the base of the skull, and use the hook to pull the brain out in pieces. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described this. They extract the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook, taking part of it out this way and the rest by pouring in drugs. After removing what they could with hooks, they would pour cedar oil or similar liquids into the skull cavity, swirl it around to dissolve remaining brain tissue, then drain it out through the nose. The embalmers considered the brain useless and discarded it. The heart, however, was left inside the body. The ancient Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory. It would be needed in the afterlife for the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at to determine if they had lived a good life. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, a demon, and the person would cease to exist forever. After organ removal, the real preservation began. The body cavity was washed with palm wine and filled with temporary stuffing, linen, sawdust, or myrrh to maintain the body's shape. Then came the crucial step: desiccation, drying out all moisture using a naturally occurring salt called natron. Natron is a mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate found in dried lake beds in Egypt. It's a powerful desiccant that draws water out of organic material while also having antibacterial properties. The embalmers would pile natron salt all over and inside the body, completely covering it. Then they would leave it for exactly 40 days. During this time, the natron would absorb all moisture from the tissues. The body would lose about 75% of its weight. The skin would become leathery and darkened. The features would shrink, but the body would be preserved, no longer able to decay, because bacteria need moisture to grow. After 40 days, the embalmers would remove the natron, revealing a dried, preserved corpse. They would wash the body again, this time with Nile water and oils. The temporary stuffing would be removed, and the body cavity would be packed with linen, sawdust mixed with myrrh and cinnamon, and sometimes small packets containing the dried organs. The abdominal incision would be closed and covered with a protective amulet. Then the embalmers would begin the cosmetic restoration. They would pack the nostrils with wax or linen to restore their shape. They would place artificial eyes made of stone or painted linen in the eye sockets. They would apply cosmetics to the face. For royal mummies and wealthy individuals, they would even pack the cheeks and other areas under the skin with linen to restore a more lifelike appearance. Finally, they would coat the entire body with heated resin or pine pitch, which would harden into a protective shell. The final phase, lasting about 15 days, involved wrapping. This wasn't simply bandaging a body. It was a sacred ritual involving hundreds of yards of linen and dozens of protective amulets. The wrapping began with the fingers and toes, each individually wrapped. Then the limbs, then the torso, then the entire body, with priests reciting spells from the Book of the Dead at each stage. As they wrapped, they placed amulets between the layers, scarabs over the heart, the Eye of Horus for protection, jed pillars for stability, ankhs for life, and many others. Over 140 amulets have been found in a single royal mummy. Each amulet was positioned according to religious texts and had a specific protective purpose. The linen wrappings could total over 1,000 feet of fabric. For royal mummies, the finest linen was used, sometimes with gold leaf between the layers. The wrapping process created a cocoon-like form. The wrapped mummy would then be placed in a cartonnage, a close-fitting case made of linen or papyrus soaked in plaster, molded to the body's shape and painted with the deceased's face and religious scenes. This cartonnage will be placed inside one or more wooden coffins, which themselves are placed inside a stone sarcophagus for royal burials. But not everyone received such elaborate treatment. The mummification process described above was the most expensive option, costing about a year's income for an average family. Ancient sources describe 3 levels of mummification service. The top tier included everything described above. The middle tier skipped some of the organ removal and used less expensive materials. The bottom tier was essentially just drying the body with natron and wrapping it in basic linen. Poor people often couldn't afford any mummification and were buried in the hot, dry sand, which sometimes naturally desiccated and preserved them accidentally. On the 70th day after death, the mummy was ready for burial. But before the tomb was sealed, one final crucial ritual had to be performed: the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ritual, dating back over 4,000 years, was designed to restore the deceased's senses so they could eat, drink, see, hear, and speak in the afterlife. A priest wearing the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, would use special instruments to symbolically touch the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose. The most important tool was the adze, a curved blade that would be touched to the mummy's mouth while reciting, "Your mouth is opened by Horus with his little finger." This ritual was accompanied by sacrifices of animals, burning of incense, and offerings of food, drink, and precious objects that would be sealed in the tomb with the deceased. The family of a deceased would perform mourning rituals, with professional mourners, usually women, wailing and throwing dust on their heads. Then the mummy, in its nested coffins, would be placed in the tomb, surrounded by everything needed for the afterlife: food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, servants in the form of shabby statues, and texts like the Book of the Dead with spells to guide the journey through the underworld. The tomb would be sealed, and ideally, the mummy would rest undisturbed for eternity. Of course, this rarely happened. Tomb robbers broke into most burials within years or decades, stealing treasures and often destroying mummies in the process. The few intact royal mummies we have, like Tutankhamun, are extraordinary exceptions. Even so, thousands of mummies survive in museums and tombs worldwide, testament to the effectiveness of ancient Egyptian preservation techniques. Why do mummies still exist after over 3,000 years? The answer is the combination of intentional preservation and Egypt's unique environment. The natron desiccation removed moisture. The resin coating created a protective barrier, and the wrappings provided physical protection. But Egypt's hot, dry climate was equally important. Many mummies survived because they were buried in the desert where there's almost no humidity or rainfall to cause decay. When archaeologists unwrap mummies today using CT scans and digital analysis rather than physical unwrapping, they discover incredible details. We can see their faces, determine their age at death, identify diseases they suffered, analyze their diet from isotope testing, and even recover DNA. The mummy of Ramses II, who died over 3,200 years ago, still has red hair visible. We can see arthritic damage in elderly mummies' joints and dental problems from eating sandy bread. Some mummies still have intact internal organs, fingerprints, and even brain tissue despite the removal attempts. Mummification represents ancient Egypt's triumph over death, at least physically. The pharaohs and nobles who underwent this process wanted to live forever, and in a sense, they succeeded. We know their names, see their faces, study their lives, and stand in awe of the civilization that developed such sophisticated preservation techniques. The 70-day journey from death to mummy was ancient Egypt's most profound religious act, combining medical knowledge, chemical expertise, religious devotion, and artistic skill. 3 millennia later, those wrapped bodies still speak to us, telling stories of a culture that refused to accept death as the end and prove that with dedication and skill, the human body can indeed outlast empires.